The Israeli military declined to comment. A senior U.S. official said that Israeli had notified the United States through multiple channels shortly before the attack. This is from the New York Times, which makes me think, is there like a Middle East bombing hotline where you call up the United States government and they go, press 1 if you're bombing Israel, press 2 if you're bombing the Houthis, press 3 if you're bombing some other territory. And they go, okay, please hold. And then someone gets on the line and they go, all right, what were you looking to bomb? Okay, cool. No problem. Let me check, see if you got approval. What was your account number again? What was, okay, 347842, killing random people in Iran, approved.
As more and more begin to know the status quo has got to go, they're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
This story first broke. It was first reported by ABC News. They cited a U.S. official who said Israeli missiles hit Iran, which made it sound like it was a very big attack. But then it came out that Iranian media, they're reporting right now, as of right now, it's 12:30 a.m. Friday morning on the East Coast in the U.S. So details of this are still not clear. But Iranian media is reporting that 3 drones were intercepted in Isfahan, in the province of Isfahan. And that was the explosions that were reported, because initially it was actually explosions reported in Iran, and then the U.S. official saying that Israeli missiles hit Iran. Now they're saying the explosions, at least Iran is saying, the Iranian media, saying that the explosions were drones being destroyed by air defenses. Again, lots of details are unclear at this point. And there was other reports that say there was explosions in Syria and Iraq. Some reports said that there were airstrikes in Syria, and there was aircraft activity reported, but that's all very unconfirmed at this point too. Initially, it did seem like some sort of very big attack was happening with explosions reported in Iran, Syria, Iraq, and all that. So according to CNN, the U.S. knew that Israel was planning to hit Iran with the understanding that nuclear sites would not be targeted. Iranian media is reporting that nuclear sites in Isfahan are safe. So on Thursday, Iranian officials warned that if Israel targeted nuclear sites, Iran would launch tit-for-tat strikes on Israeli nuclear facilities. So, but it looks like Israel did not target Iranian nuclear facilities. But at the same time, while this does seem pretty limited right now, Iran's president, Ebrahim Raisi, has been warning of a major response to any type of Israeli attack. He basically said if they launch the slightest attack on us, we're going to hit them much harder than we did. So there's still the risk of this thing really exploding. It's amazing. I was watching the ABC News coverage of this. No mention of Israel bombing Iran's consulate in Damascus. I mean, it was really unbelievable. They kept saying, Israel had to respond to this unprecedented Iranian attack on their territory, which, of course, Israel started this escalation by bombing Iran's embassy, by bombing an Iranian diplomatic facility and killing 7 Iranians. I believe they killed a total of 16 people, including 7 members of the IRGC and a very senior Quds Force commander. So the White House said in a statement on Thursday that the U.S. and Israel have a shared objective to see Hamas defeated in Rafah, which is the southern city in the Gaza Strip that's packed with over 1 million Palestinian civilians. So this statement came following talks between U.S. and Israeli officials that covered Iran's reprisal attack on Israel and Israeli plans to invade Rafah. The U.S. has expressed concerns about the potential assault because it will cause mass civilian casualties, but the U.S. ultimately appears to support the idea of Israel attacking the city based on this statement. And these talks were between Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, and the Israeli Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who's a former U.S. ambassador to the U.S., and Satsi Hanegbi, who is Israel's National Security Advisor. So the White House said in a statement, quote, the 2 sides agreed on the shared objective to see Hamas defeated in Rafah. U.S. participants expressed concerns with various courses of action in Rafah, and Israeli participants agreed to take these concerns into account and to have further follow-up discussions, end quote. So these same officials met back on April 1st to discuss Rafah, and the White House put out a nearly identical press release. So it doesn't seem like there's really any progress being made here. The U.S. is claiming that it's concerned, but it doesn't look like it's putting any real pressure on Israel, as we saw that report that Israel apparently planned to do this Rafah invasion. They were going to start by dropping leaflets on the city on Monday, but which goes to show that they don't have any real plan for the civilians that are there, any real evacuation plan if they're just going to drop leaflets and then go ahead with the invasion. Articles from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So Green has proposed an amendment requiring lawmakers who vote in favor of the $60 billion Ukrainian aid bill to join the country's military. And she's also, along with Thomas Massie, saying that they're going to try to oust Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, over this bill that he has put forward, these multiple foreign military aid bills that add up to $95 billion, exactly what Biden wanted. So the Green is, putting this amendment forward. It doesn't have any chance of passing, but it's definitely, kind of funny and interesting. And I think by her logic, if I'm correct, that she's probably going to vote for the Israel aid. By this logic, I guess she's got to go sign up for the IDF. She wrote on X, quote, "If you want to fund the endless foreign wars, you should have to go fight them. That's why I'm introducing an amendment that would require any member of Congress who votes for the multi-billion-dollar Ukraine supplemental to enlist in Ukraine's military," end quote. She also introduced amendments that would direct funding from Ukraine to space lasers to defend the southwest border or aid to Americans impacted by a major train derailment in Ohio and wildfires in Hawaii. And she's introducing these amendments kind of to stick it to Johnson. That's the idea here. So we'll see what happens. There was a lot of talk today about the potential of Johnson being ousted, of them invoking this motion to vacate the speakership. We'll see what happens with that. I think the Democrats are going to bail him out because he gave them everything that they wanted.
Live from Run Your Mouth World Headquarters, it's today's Run Your Mouth.
From the New York Times, miscalculation led to escalation and clash between Israel and Iran. With the reason that this thing kicked off is because they targeted an embassy, they killed a general, and Israel was going, we didn't think they'd mind. It was a free demolition. We didn't even know they liked that building. It wasn't that nice of a building. So there you go. Israel, they're reporting back. We didn't even think they'd care if we hit their embassy. And then everyone was getting upset with Israel. Iran, they do the coordinated strike back. They get permission from the United States of America. They get their orders of what they can do that won't escalate the situation. They do it. Nothing gets hurt. Nothing gets bombed. No big deal. And then Israel turns around and goes, you're not going to tell us that we can't bomb them back. We're going to make our own decisions, basically going straight, quit telling me what to do, Mom. And then Mom is like, can you stop just blowing things up and be more like the other countries that don't just go blow things up? And they're like, no, quit telling me what to do. And so what do? They hit them back. This is from the Week magazine. I loved this line. Israel, the Times said, Israel can do elegant military maneuvers that are not noisy or cause significantly military damage, but which deliver the message Israel wants. It's like a diving contest where Israel's giving itself a 10. In this theater of non-war war, Israel's getting a 10 ranking for evading the missile systems or whatever can shoot down invaders in Iran and successfully hitting a target that was not an important target and making a soft landing without much of a splash. And, usually Israel, they hit all sorts of civilians all over the place. So you got to give them some credit here for actually pinpointing a target and not killing random innocent people. I mean, usually when Israel's bombing things, maybe this might make their entire Gaza operations look bad. But when it comes to this particular targeted missile strike, the people sat on the sideline like a diver. They held up their signs, and Israel's giving itself a 10 on its latest war theater. Now, this is from the New York Times. Iranian and Israel television played down the strike, as did some officials. A newsreader in Iran described the attack as not a big deal. And, Iran's being surprisingly chill about all this, right? You would think for your mortal enemy, for the people that are out there building a nuclear bomb, want to do nothing but destroy your country. And this one, they're just going, not a big deal. All right, whatever. They sent some drones over here and they bombed the building. No big deal. There you go. Iran, surprisingly chill. Maybe they got legal weed and kratom out there or something. Nancy Pelosi is putting out a new book, The Art of Power. My Story as America's First Women Speaker of the House by Nancy Pelosi. And I'm looking at it. I don't know. Doesn't it feel like she touches like a lot of things in a weird way? Seeing Nancy Pelosi from behind in some really creepy, like lizard pose where it's like, just feeling the door for the energy. And that's like her in some weird way. You look at you're like, that's her. That's her quintessential pose in some weird way, right? Doesn't she just kind of touch things a lot? I don't know. And The Art of Power, how to make sure that your husband has normal access to male hookers. The Art of Power. Is there going to be a chapter on insider trading? Will there be chapter 3? How to be one of the greatest stock pickers in human history? Why Biden is pushing to triple Chinese steel tariffs. But Biden's got a new plan for beating inflation, which is you've got inflation is pushing the prices up. And so you can beat inflation if you can push up the prices even more. That's how you beat inflation, right? Inflation's driving up prices. So if you can step into the market and do even more to step up the prices, that's how you beat inflation. This is Biden's new plan. I'm going to show you prices, okay? You think the grocery stores are going to keep going up in price? I'll show you, Buster. I'll make all your supplies more expensive. whole building's going to be more expensive. It's like, I don't know why Donald Trump's been talking about steel tariffs as well. Good luck with the tariffs and bringing down prices, everybody. You've got Johnson, who's trying to work it, make sure that he can get the money to the rest of the world, letting people know we can't afford to play politics on this. We have to do the right thing. Because that's not playing politics. It's just determining that your opinion is the right thing and that no one's allowed to argue with you. And then, so are there other things that you think would be the right thing, but you can afford to play politics with? So, like, can Mike Johnson explain to us what this phrase means that they like to say, if we can't afford to play politics with this one? So basically, you go out every single day and you guys pretend to bicker and argue about some things because that's how you keep your jobs. It's a sport. You're playing politics. We all understand that sometimes we go out there, we play this game. It's called politics, and that's the show. And then sometimes we actually sit down and there's things that we care about, and so we just pass them. And so this is one of the things where we don't need to engage in that theater and that whole game, that thing that we do for CNN and Fox News to keep the voters entertained, to keep the people like me being able to, create a show and have sponsor dollars. It's WWF. And so there's a lot of topics where we can go out there and we can pretend to have a match with each other, but then there's some other ones that are just so important that, we can all just decide, hey, let's do away with. Isn't politics the process by which you guys debate who's actually being right? Isn't that, if there's a better process, can you explain to us what that process is? Or what would be the process of deciding what should be a topic that you play politics with? Do you have to politic on that? How does that work? How does an argument work for deciding which topic shouldn't be debated because it's too important? And how is that not considered engaging in politics? And if you got some different structure for this, why don't we just pivot to that? And so here you have, you guys can tell me if the sound's working on this. If not, we're only showing 2 videos and we've already done enough show. But here you've got the Speaker of the House pitching on why we need to make sure that all wars everywhere, all the time, get their funding. Here we go.
Why are you willing to risk losing your job over this Ukraine funding?
Listen, my philosophy is you do the right thing and you let the chips fall where they may. I don't, if I operated out of fear over a motion to vacate, I would never be able to do my job. Look, history judges us for what we do. This is a critical time right now, a critical time on the world stage. I could make a, I could make a selfish decision and do something that's different, but I'm doing here what I believe to be the right thing. I think providing lethal aid to Ukraine right now is critically important. I really do. I really do believe the intel and the briefings that we've gotten that I believe Xi and Vladimir Putin and Iran really are an axis of evil. I think they're in coordination on this. I think that Vladimir Putin would continue to march through Europe if he were allowed. I think he might go to the Balkans next. I think he might.
When you have to use language like I truly believe, I really believe, that means you probably don't have good evidence to actually substantiate your opinion. Like if someone said, well, what evidence do you have of this? And you got to pivot to, well, I just really believe it. So does that mean you don't have good evidence for this position? Why do you have to really believe it? Can't you just tell me like what the intelligence is?
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in search of its identity, 1913 to 2023. So what we decided we would do, because it is 2024 and therefore 100 years since the death of Vladimir Lenin, let's talk about this very interesting figure. And one of the things I remember from your course was you referred to the, quote, good Lenin, bad Stalin myth, which I ran into a lot. There were the Workers' Vanguard communist newspaper, as you know, was sold on the streets of Cambridge. And that was their line, that 1917 was a glorious thing. And it was very unfortunately derailed by Stalin. So that'll be a little bit in the background of what we say. Given that the Bolsheviks were an extremely tiny minority, do you think it is too provocative, or do you think it is maybe conceptually helpful to think of the Bolshevik Revolution as some kind of a conspiracy?
Well, no, it was not a conspiracy, because this was the time when all political parties were exploding. This was the time when the Tsarism collapsed, and anybody could do anything. So this is the figures that I cite in my previous book on the political parties and social movements in the Russian Civil War. At the beginning of 1917, just imagine, there were 25,000 Bolsheviks, 25,000 in a country of 150 million. So this was nothing. It was just a tiny circle of intellectuals. There were about 50,000 Mensheviks, and there were about 100,000 SRs, socialist revolutionaries, because they had their, intelligentsia all over Russia in the provinces. So by the end of 1917, there was 1 million SRs, 250,000 Bolsheviks, and 200,000 Mensheviks, which means every political party just exploded. But, and here's what I argue in my reasoning, the SRs a lot of them were rural intelligentsia and kind of educated, literate peasants. And the Mensheviks, there were many workers, actual real workers who were mostly skilled. If you look at the membership of the Bolshevik Party, these were angry soldiers who were tired of World War I. And the only thing they understood by the word Bolshevism is stop the war now, as the slogan was, bayonets into the ground and go home. So their Bolshevism was very, very superficial. They just didn't want the war to go on, and they would support any party that promised immediate peace. This was one of the great reasons why the Bolsheviks seized power. When people supported the Bolsheviks in 1917, it was not to establish dictatorship of the proletariat, not to create some kind of workers' socialism. It was overwhelmingly one purpose only: stop the war now.
Now, sometimes I would hear that the dictatorial style, let's say, by which Lenin governed, was dictated not so much because that was his preference, but because he was surrounded by enemies, internal enemies, and it was a crisis, and what do you expect? What's the response to that?
Yeah, that really, we're close to the key of it. One thing, if we continue on 1918, which is partly in my book, The Bolsheviks After October, what happened was that Lenin was very quickly losing the support of people that was there for the ending of the war. Because the war ended, that's it. The peasants go home. The workers want jobs. There are no jobs. The industry is ruined. And the peasants, once they get home, they stop being Bolsheviks. They become peasants. So what do peasants want? The peasants want to sow and sell. They want to sow grain and sell it. And this is where Lenin says, no. You're not going to be able to sell anything because we're going to have state controls over food production. And that's the beginning of a great civil war between the Bolsheviks and peasants, which of course goes on for many years, for 1918, 1919, 1920. Now, the key argument that I make in the book of the Civil War is that the only reason the whites were able to mount a serious challenge to the Bolsheviks, the only reason was because they were moving into territories that were already in uprising against the Bolshevik rule, peasant territories. In other words, peasant rebellions cleared the way for the whites, and the whites came in and occupied the territories. They were good organizers, good army men, good administrators, and that's why they managed to challenge Lenin. To put it another way, if there hadn't been peasant rebellions, and there wouldn't have been any if Lenin didn't come up with his crazy policy of grain requisitioning, then his enemies would have been much weaker than they actually turned out to be.
Could you explain, just for people who might not know about the Russian Civil War, who the whites were? It's a very broad term that seems to be able to be applied to numerous kinds of people.
Yes, very, very good point. The whites were Russian officers from the Imperial Army. That's pretty much all they were. There was nobody else, pretty much. They were officers who basically felt that their duty was to defend Mother Russia. Not so much for the Tsar. Many of them were Republicans, but they were absolutely patriotic and against the communists and the Bolsheviks. And not so much because they opposed there's some worker policy or some capitalism or socialism. No, they basically wanted great Russia. And from their point of view, the Bolsheviks ruined it. And therefore, they had to be opposed for the, as they called it, great and indivisible Russia. So they were patriots. But the life in the cities was fundamentally different. I describe it too in one of my pieces, is that already 1 month after the Bolsheviks took power, 1 month, well-dressed people disappeared. Just disappeared. Everybody, there was no trade anymore. Markets disappeared. Shops disappeared. Banks were robbed. Essentially, the so-called nationalization was the Bolshevik gangs would seize the banks and divide up the money. And there was no police. There were gangs of people who would burst into bourgeois apartments, kill the men, rape the women, take all the valuables, and consider it that the proletarians have divided up the wealth of the bourgeoisie. This was called the Loot the Looters campaign. Then there was another campaign of using bourgeois apartments for the proletarians, which means you could kick out the rich people and move in yourself and call yourself a proletarian. So it was really free for all. It was lawlessness that is a state policy. To abuse rich people became a normal practice. It was very hard time for, if you're a lawyer or an engineer or anybody who is dressed in a normal European way, the way we're dressed now, you're in trouble. The best thing to survive is to try to dress as a peasant, hide all the valuables you have, sell them one at a time, and the best thing is just leave Petrograd or Moscow and go out to the south where there still are Cossacks and the whites and where you could still survive. And that's many, many Russians did that.
Thomas Jefferson's chilling warnings about unchecked fiat paper money proved prophetic as the U.S. plunged into its first boom-bust economic crisis in the early 19th century. That's how Mike Meharry kicked off a great new article we published just yesterday, going through Jefferson's warnings about the dangers of fiat money printing. Mike points out that the economic downturn came on the heels of the War of 1812. As so often happens, war results in all kinds of other problems even after the fact. Mike said that after the war, which ended in 1815, banknotes began to rapidly depreciate due to the exponential increase in the amount of paper in circulation. So when they print up a bunch of stuff to be able to fund government stuff that they couldn't afford to do based on, well, the economic situation of the time, it takes a little time before the impact of that happens. We see how this is playing out today with so much price inflation that has been the result of so much depreciation or inflation of the money supply a few years ago. Even if they slow it down and cut it off now, it could still continue to get worse as the money circulates through the economy. As Rothbard pointed out in his book, The Panic of 1819, to fund the war, the federal government turned to state-chartered banks. The reason was there was no central bank at the time. The first bank of the United States, its charter expired, and there was no central bank. There wasn't a second bank of the United States established till 1816 after the war was over, and it didn't open for business till 1817. So the feds couldn't just print what they wanted. So this proliferation of state government chartered banks started doing it instead. And the feds, Mike writes, turned to these state chartered banks, and they issued large numbers of paper money banknotes, far exceeding the amount of gold to back them. He said this caused this money printing beyond, or this banknote printing beyond the amount of specie to back it, caused the gold to drain from these banks. But to keep the money flowing, the feds agreed to a suspension of specie payments so they wouldn't lose what they had left. And the situation then persisted well after the war ended. This allowed the banks, Mike writes, to make loans with little to no regard for gold reserves to back them, which is causing more and more problems. Of course, this is a formula, as Mike points out, for disaster. Thomas Jefferson understood this all too well, making his views clear in that same letter to Cooper in 1814. Here's how Jefferson put it. I am an enemy to all banks discounting bills or notes for anything but coin. But our whole country is so fascinated with this jack-lantern wealth that they will not stop short of its total and fatal explosion. Or we could call it an implosion, is how we probably refer to it today. But people get fascinated by stimulus checks and government handouts. And they think that they're rich. They think that just having more dollars in their hands means they have more money, and they don't think about the impact of it later on. It's short-term thinking, and maybe it seems great today, but it certainly causes a lot of what we would refer to as malinvestment. Because if you encourage people, for example, they give people a bunch of stimulus checks to stay at home and not work, then maybe they are more willing to spend an excessive amount, like $10 on a cupcake. And then people who want to start a business, they think that a cupcake business that can have enough customers to sell $10 cupcakes is a worthy thing to start going. And then you get a boom in a cupcake business. I think there's been some research and articles done on this particular scenario. Hopefully it's a decent example, but eventually things come crashing down and people stop being able to afford the $10 cupcakes, and they might want to get something on discount, and then all of a sudden they all go out of business, et cetera, et cetera. This is an example, maybe a silly one, of a malinvestment, but there were serious ones that happened at that time that Jefferson was writing. And Mike says whenever the money supply rapidly expands, as it did during the War of 1812, that is, it creates all kinds of malinvestments in the economy. The expansion of credit-fueled land speculation in the West, that likely would not have happened in a more sound monetary environment. Historian George Dangerfield argued that the entire post-war American economy was, quote, based on a land boom. So people had extra money because it was being printed beyond what was actually available to redeem in specie. And so then they started investing in stuff. You can be more risky the more access to funds that you have. And Mike writes that since the U.S. Treasury accepted payments for land in the form of state-issued banknotes, state-chartered banks helped fund the land boom. But the problem was most of them lacked sufficient specie to back their paper. Now, after it opened for business in 1817, the second bank of the U.S. supposedly was going to get this all under control, but it jumped right in to further expand money and credit. And here from Rothbard's book, he notes that by the beginning of 1818, so mind you, it's barely open a year, the bank had loaned out over $41 million. Its note issue outstanding reached $10 million, and its demand deposits $13 million, for a total money issue of $23 million. Short version, $23 million by early 1818. But it was contrasted with a specie reserve, so gold reserve, of $2.5 billion. Rothbard basically points out that what would have been considered stable, not risking the bank's solvency, was about a 5-to-1 ratio. And here we're close to double that, about 10-to-1. And so Rothbard points out that the boom therefore continued in 1818, this land speculation boom, with the Bank of the U.S. acting as an expansionary rather than as a limiting force. The expansionist attitude of the bank was also encouraged by the Treasury. Of course, they were all in on this kind of thing. But that year in 1818, Mike points out that the second bank of the U.S. tried to rein in the problem. They started saying, okay, let's try to get this under control. sounds familiar to what we have today. They participate in creating the problem, and then all of a sudden they're going to say, well, we're going to fix it. So the way they tried to do that was by curtailing loans by its western branches. But when the state banks began presenting their banknotes for redemption at the second bank of the U.S., it refused to provide gold specie from its reserves. There was simply too much paper and not enough gold. So then the state banks did the only thing they could do at that point. They had to start foreclosing on heavily mortgaged farms and business properties. So what's the result? Almost absolute chaos. And again, this is going to sound pretty familiar to us today. We have widespread bankruptcies. They start seeing bank failures. There were a bunch of them all the way through, I think, 1823. There's high unemployment, all the stuff that Thomas Jefferson basically predicted. And here he is in a letter responding to something from John Adams, which I'll get to in a moment. Jefferson predicted that this is going to keep happening. Boom, crash, boom, bust, over and over and over until people understood the root cause, which of course was a depreciated fiat paper currency. Printing is the root cause. And Jefferson put it this way: the evils of this deluge of paper money are not to be removed until our citizens are generally and radically instructed in their cause and consequences. And what's the problem, of course? As I keep saying, what Jefferson pointed out, the problem is fiat paper money printing.
Problem's been around, like I said, for a long time. Even the Romans knew about it, and when government gets too big or countries get too aggressive and extend themselves too far in foreign policy, it brings on conditions that we have right now. But the founders understood it completely and totally because they went through the revolutionary period with a continental dollar, and the dollar went to zero because it was a fiat currency, and they just created the money, and it had to run away inflation. And all that put together, the history that the founders understood and knew about, along with what was happening during the revolutionary period, they spent some time on trying to devise a monetary system that would prevent this from happening. So they said only gold and silver could be legal tender, that there could not be any paper money, and they called that emitting bills of credit, and that is in the Constitution. And they said explicitly to the states, which they saw as independent units close to being their own country, coming together voluntarily, and the agreement in the Constitution was that they would come together, and they too would accept only gold and silver as the main currency. That would be one way that the colonies would become more unified. And of course they did this, but it didn't work. There's hardly any talk about it anymore, seriously following what the Constitution says. But ultimately, the reforms will have to restudy that. And I think that should be looked at as a guideline. But I think there are things in this age that we live in, there's a better understanding, economic understanding of what we can do and permit, competition and permit more access to alternatives. But at the same time, making it a prohibition for governments to be legalized to defraud the people, and that is run a fiat system, which is fraud, it's theft, it's a tax, and it's a convenient process that has been always beneficial to the very wealthy, those who accumulate wealth. And just look now at the pharmaceutical industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the medical industrial complex. All of this is done because the system encourages endless spending. Deficits don't matter, and if you're powerful enough with the military and your currency is strong enough, you can get away with this for a while. And we've gotten away with it essentially since World War II. But it's catching up to us, it's catching up to the world. There's a movement called the BRIC movement in currencies. There's people who are now dead set on competing with the dollar. The dollar is not as strong as it used to be. It's making it more difficult. There's more arguments in the Congress now over the expenditures, but we still have a long way to go, because the biggest thing is to correct it and deal with this. The deficit has to be eliminated.
The reason why counterfeiting is legitimately a crime, because it ruins the counterfeiter. See, especially in our country, at that time, they're like, oh, we could print the money. Let's try to take over the world. They lose their minds. They can't think straight. They could print whatever they want, though, in their minds. We could bribe our own government. We could bribe other governments around the world, get them to do what we want. Media, schools, control them completely. And we could just print whatever money we need. We don't have to worry about taxing, directly. We'll just create the money. But look at what it has done. It has destroyed the counterfeiter. The wars, all they can think about is foreign nations. The money goes to foreign nations, to Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and our border is open for anybody to come in. So it's destroying the counterfeiter. And the wars have been disasters ever since Vietnam. They lost that one. They did not remake Iraq into a little America with McDonald's everywhere and all our so-called values. They did not. Assad did not go. Ukraine did not work out. It took 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Now we're bumping up against the big boys, the nuclear powers, the ones that could harm us and actually defeat us. But again, the counterfeiters have lost their mind. They think it's their destiny to print money and take over the world, and it's not. But they're destroying us here. And if they get into a Middle East war, if we have inflation now, imagine what happens if the Strait of Hormuz is closed by Iran, if oil skyrockets. I mean, the amount of economic damage that could cause for a war that has nothing to do with us. But again, the counterfeiters don't think straight. They don't think like us or the regular people that don't want any of this to happen. So we're in a bind. We're ruled by people that have lost their minds, and it's not good for us. So, but the more people that learn about this stuff, learn about sound money, when they ultimately fail, at least we can build on the ashes they create.
That is why certain freedoms have to be protected. One is the First Amendment. Just think of the control of speech there was under COVID. And it's still, there's more and more of that happening all the time. We have to maintain this because it is the people that indirectly or directly, they have to give support to this. And yet I think the knowledge about monetary policy, it is not complicated, and it's better understood now than at the time of our revolution and our Constitution, because there were some serious errors in there that avoiding that would have made it maybe a little more difficult. But it is human nature to, throughout all of history, for governments to get control of the money, one way or the other. But there's been times when it's been much freer than others, and during those periods of time there was much more economic growth. So this issue is going to be wrong. It motivates me because it's an attack on personal liberty, and we have to do something like that. And it also motivates me because the people who suffer the most are the people who think they're getting the best deal out of deficits in a welfare system. And those wealthy welfare recipients have to be taught a lesson that their largesse can't continue forever. So we're at a stage where there is a transition from this total dependency and trust in governments running a fiat system. It has to change. It's going to change. The big question is what's going to happen. So I invite all people who are willing to listen to participate in passing this information, whether it's for your own sake of wanting to protect your liberty as well as your own system and your wealth, so you can take care of your family and others. So there's a job ahead, but it has to be an important one. But the whole issue of inflation is not difficult to understand. So I invite you to further investigate this. One of the people that I did read a lot on, the Austrian economists I followed a whole lot, was Murray Rothbard, but they all are good, and there's still a lot of them good, and they were the ones that I was reading before Bretton Woods broke down. So this is up to us, and to me it's ideological and motivation, and right now I think the field is fertile out there for us offering the case for sound money, and therefore opening up the doors to peace and prosperity, which should be the goal of all Americans. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.